Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm here with Dr. Lisa, and it's like a miracle, right, that we got to see each other this past week. Where hopefully
Yes.
that number for this year will go up as we barrel into these last few months of the year. But it's like miraculous that we were actually in one place, one state.
I know. It was really good to see you in person in the flesh.
Yes,
So to speak,
absolutely.
so to speak. Yes. And yeah, that'll happen again, I'm sure, when we head to Dallas a
Yeah.
thousand more times.
That's it. Absolutely. Well, look, I'm afraid to ask about weather because I know that you've been making some huge moves. And so the cooperation of weather is important. So please tell me that it's decent, hopefully.
Yes, weather's been great. I mean, it's
Oh,
87 right
good.
now, but it has been in the 90s. But while I was away, I had my modem delivered, and it sat out in two thunderstorms, and I thought that was a surefire. It's not going to work, but it
Oh,
did.
no.
So it did work. Yeah,
Really? Oh
yeah.
my, so it didn't get wet? It stayed dry?
It did get wet. Yeah.
And
I
it
mean
still
the
worked.
and it still worked because that's why I was like, I'm not gonna have internet to record.
Right,
But
right, right.
yeah, yep.
Oh
So
my
look at that.
gosh.
Yeah.
Well, oof, let's hope it keeps working. We need to stay on the air.
Yep, we
So,
do.
oh, that's great. Okay, that's good to hear. All
Hmm.
right. Well, Dr. Lisa, take us into the word of the week. I appreciate all the words of the week because I don't want to assume we're all speaking from the same language quite literally when it comes to
Yeah.
this stuff.
Yeah, so we've talked about this most likely in our podcast, but we figured that we would just put a little spotlight on it. So, unconscious bias. Um, this is something I think that's going to play in quite a lot in the coming months as we barrel towards the presidential election in the ways in which we think about and judge candidates and make assessments of their capacity to lead and to be our elected representatives. So, as if you're anything like Shaunna and I, you are taking in a million pieces of information all of the time and trying to gather as much information as is humanly possible. But even with all that information coming at us through 24-hour news cycles and the internet, we actually can only understand about 50 pieces of information and then actually retain about seven, it sounds like. So you're being like bombarded fire hose like with all this information, and the only way that your brain can kind of process or manage that is by taking shortcuts. And these shortcuts are based on often on stereotypes, whether that's positive or negative, or, interactions that you might have had with a group or a person in the past. And so rather than taking the time to fully process, your brain jumps from like A to F. And makes assumptions. And that's all happening unconsciously in your brain, enabling you to be able to move more quickly through the world, right? And that then impacts or affects how we think about people, how we think about groups, how we think about issues. So unconscious bias obviously became a massive issue after George Floyd was murdered, and tons
Mm-hmm.
of organizations and companies started doing training on it. And I think it was pretty transformational for a lot of people who hadn't thought about the ways in which this unconscious bias was operating in their lives when they would be, think themselves to be not sexist or not racist, right? But then not realizing
Mm-hmm.
the way that these shortcuts were happening as they were,
Mm-hmm.
trying to kind of make it through the world. So we just wanted to raise that and flag it and readdress it as we move towards this November
Mm-hmm.
date that is going to have quite large consequences.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, and I appreciate this particular word because oftentimes I hear a number of different words that are branches from the same tree of bias that are thrown out there. So whether it's just bias, conscious bias, unconscious bias, hidden bias, all these different words that kind of branch from that tree. I think, unfortunately, what people don't want to hear is actually this version of it is that, sure, someone should be accountable or they should be held accountable if they are consciously taking action based on bias. And I'm thinking, it's much more gray area in that we're unconsciously making decisions based on the software that's running in our brain to make information process quicker. And so I'm more concerned with those unconscious things that people haven't slowed down, like you mentioned, to think about, and they just let the software run in their brain and not questioning themselves as to why do I think the way I do.
Right, right,
Haven't really thought
exactly,
about it. Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, yes, when we're thinking about the outcomes of this upcoming election, and November 5th is coming very soon. So, with that, I think it would be appropriate for us. Dr. Lisa and I both were on site with a client last week. And so it was pretty difficult for me personally, having 3 straight days of trainings with the client and so forth, to even make space in my brain to process that there was a Democratic National Convention happening. But I caught as many sound bites as I could until I was able to kind of take in all the speakers and the agendas for each day. Even the structure, Lisa, around some of the choices that they made around who was invited and who wasn't. So, for example, I've been really thinking often about the intergenerational impact of almost everything. And the fact that they specifically invited social media voices that look like the country, but also already had big platforms around society, politics, all the things, social justice, intentionally inviting them to be there and give their lens of the coverage in ways that other conventions have not, including DNC conventions have not. And so I just had to stop and think about what I made time to take in and what I did not make time to take in. So while we were out of town and traveling and so forth, I made it my business to listen to what Michelle Obama and her ponytail had to say at the DNC, right? And then I kind of sort of made time to hear what her husband had to say at the DNC. And then there are other things where I went back and replayed the whole thing. But I appreciate folks who do what I have not intentionally done, which is intentionally take in the RNC or intentionally take in voices that don't agree. I have a couple of folks that I'm following on LinkedIn right now who are not excited and throwing a pep rally around either the RNC or the DNC because they feel so strongly about certain issues that aren't being addressed by either party. And so, it just made me take pause, Lisa, and think about what are we taking in? What are we intentionally taking in? What are we intentionally not taking in? And how that fits into that whole visual that I'm sure you've seen before, Lisa, around that media bias chart, where it literally charts the media outlet based on how much or how little bias and in what direction. So more or less liberally biased, more or less conservatively biased. It's got me thinking now I need to clean up my podcast list, my all the things, so that I can be more diverse in the information that I take in. But anyway, I'll stop there. But Lisa, are you doing anything intentionally that I need to take note of here? Because clearly some
Mm-hmm.
folks are doing that and some are not. And I'm just over here hanging out with Michelle Obama's ponytail. I don't know. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, Michelle Obama was amazing.
Yes,
In
yes.
all the ways. So I did watch some of the RNC on purpose. It was hard because obviously ideologically the folks who are there are quite distant from where I am, but I did feel that it was important to be educated. I've actually never really watched intensely either of the conventions before, so the amount of convention watching I have done in the last couple of months is like extreme comparative to history. Um, but I just feel like being educated about opinions that are different from mine is a helpful way to better understand how people get to their conclusions. I mean, there's a lot of just barefaced lies that happened at the RNC, and I'm presuming people would also argue at the DNC. But I think that we echo chamber ourselves, which is what you're saying, right, Shaunna, and that we don't take the time to better understand where other people are coming from. But in the same vein, I also understand that if you have several marginalized identities, race, gender, ability, sexual orientation, watching the RNC, for example, or a far right or right leaning conservative commentator could actually be pretty emotionally painful for you, right? Like you think about being in this world is already challenging when there are so many policies and people who are arguing for you not to exist. So to then intentionally kind of put yourself in conversation with those people, whether that's through television or podcast, I also imagine would be exhausting. So I do get why some folks choose not to. So it's important, but I also get why. Like, I don't want to listen to a misogynistic dude, right? Like, I have no interest in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and even, even without watching the RNC, the commentary of folks that watched the DNC that disagreed with lots of things, and then it became, almost like a elementary school play yard where, let's tear down certain individuals or groups or identities, and specifically, having a son that's neurodivergent and hearing them rail against and speaking from such hate around that particular identity. I'm sure we could make our laundry list of particular identities. To me, I think you have a point there in regards to how do you keep yourself out of harm's way when it comes to the commentaries from all directions, yet at the same time not walk into an election uneducated and underinformed. Like that's the finest of lines to walk. When no, I don't want to vote in an uneducated manner. I want to know what I'm getting, the good, bad, and the ugly with either candidate. And at the same time, I don't want to hear things that completely denigrate so many different identities that I care about or hold myself. So yeah, you're bringing up a great point around how do we not re-traumatize ourselves with this?
Right, right. I mean, it is. I think it is. That's not a hyperbole
Yeah,
to say that it can be re traumatizing. It can be really difficult to hear
yeah.
that. I mean, presumably, if you believe very strongly that
Mm-hmm.
abortion is ending a life, right? If that is a
Mm-hmm.
position that you deeply, deeply hold, I could imagine that it would be very challenging for you to hear
Yeah.
conversation and speeches that are
Mm-hmm.
focused on expanding those options for people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't agree with that position, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to have some empathy or understanding when it's genuine, right? Like, I do believe that there are people who
Yeah.
genuinely believe what they do, but I think there are also folks who are just on the bandwagon because it is politically expedient with
Mm-hmm.
whatever topic that would be.
Mm-hmm.
Then that becomes really difficult. Like, Ted
Mm-hmm.
Cruz would be an absolute example of that. Like, one minute he's telling people at the RNC in 2016 that they should vote their conscience, and
Mm-hmm.
the next minute he is arguing that the election was stolen, right? Like, so in
Yes.
2020, yeah. So it just feels like
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Is that useful to be educated, to listen to people who are so clearly motivated by political power or their own political life versus
Mm-hmm.
people who genuinely believe in an ideological position that is different from
Mm-hmm.
my own? Like, that
Right.
might be a distinction that is valuable. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do we more easily make that distinction? Like I'm
Right.
imagining that for some folks it's hard. Like, okay, your Ted Cruz example is a perfect one that it's pretty easy to see the discrepancy. But for individuals where it's like, nope, this is my agenda, I'm sticking with this, and I need to ride this into the position that I want, and that's it. What I think is so interesting, one of the scholars that I've been following a long time, uh, an indigenous scholar that mentioned a long list of things that she did not hear at either convention. And so it made me really think about, oh, interesting, which I think about this all the time in dialogue, but from this perspective of what is being said by what's left out, right? So,
Right.
folks
Right.
not talking about particular topics like Gaza, for
Yeah.
example, people are not talking, like, they're just not talking about it. And so, that to me also says something that you mean to tell me out of all of these people that are most of them are pretty intelligent, even when you don't agree with them, pretty intelligent. You've got speech writers that are pretty intelligent
Right.
because they were
Right.
hired to help pull together the phrasing and the words for these folks that will last pretty much forever. And we can't assume that what's not said wasn't important. things were
Yeah.
left out for a reason too.
Yeah.
So, I'm still rifling through the long form videos of speeches and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not subjecting myself to sound bites because I'm trying
Yeah.
to mitigate my own bias of saying, oh, I know
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to agree with everything that that person says.
Yep.
Maybe I
Yep.
don't once I hear it in context.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I've been trying to listen to long form, for the last few days or so. Um, and it's still interesting to watch the pageantry, what's said, what's not said, who is courted, if you will, whether it's
Yep.
courted by social media or courted by entertainers or courted by whomever. I think all of it is important to watch because everything that's done is intentional. And I believe that everything that's not done is also intentional. So
Mm-hmm.
trying to absorb all that is going to take a while for me. So,
And I do think listening to rather than getting sound bites through social media,
mm-hmm.
I think it is valuable to listen to the long form. And when we say long form, for folks who haven't been
Yeah.
watching these conventions, we're talking like some speeches are 3 minutes, 6 minutes,
Yeah.
right? Like the big, like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, they were longer, right? Oprah
Right.
Winfrey. But
Mm-hmm.
many of the folks who spoke were very brief. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that you can watch the whole thing and get some more context, because that's where
Yeah.
the problems arise, is if you're forming your opinion about people who have ideological differences to you and you're doing that from a 12-second clip on TikTok, like that's the problem, right?
Yes, 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 yes. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So I still have more homework to do, Lisa. So I'm coming at this at a 30,000 foot view, knowing that I still have more listening and reading and thinking to do.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, mitigating that bias piece that we know
Yeah.
inherently comes up because,
Mm-hmm.
I've been that person that, damn near fell off the treadmill because some news was on from a channel that I'm like, there is no way in the world that what I saw can be interpreted that way, but it is, right? And holding that
Yeah.
there are folks that are interpreting similar experiences, words, thoughts in ways that we certainly would
Mm-hmm.
not. And I think that's the gist of doing this is how can we more deeply understand the logic of people that we don't agree with?
Right.
And I've done that before from a dialogue perspective of I completely understand how you got there, but I completely disagree with your final landing place,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And doing that more intentionally, so
Yep.
which takes critical thinking and the
It
willingness to
does.
be patient with ourselves and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
others around those topics. So there's some topics that I'm 2 seconds and I'm out. I can't traumatize myself by listening to this
Right.
again. Or
Yeah.
I simply can't traumatize myself, not necessarily with my disagreement of it, but the delivery of it. It's one thing to say that you don't
Right.
feel that Kamala Harris, for example, is equipped to be the president of the United States. It's another thing to attack character and other things that you want to create a caricature of. Now
Right.
we're talking about something different
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and knowing which one we're talking about here, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely.
So anyway,
Absolutely. All right. Well, lots of food for thought there, I think, as we
mm-hmm.
continue to educate ourselves and be informed. So
Yeah.
let's move into phase two here. We wanted to talk a little bit about inclusive and exclusive business practices, but more specifically the exclusive of that partnership, because I think sometimes when we are trying to be inclusive leaders, inclusive business owners, we often misstep because we try to create opportunities for conversation, communication, interaction, and believing that to be universally inclusive when perhaps it isn't. So the first thing I think that we should talk about, and I'd love to hear your perspective, Shaunna, is what are you on open door policies? So I'm a leader of an organization, and I really want my employees
Mm.
to feel comfortable and at home, right? And I'm like, come to
Mm-hmm.
me anytime, open door, whenever you want to come. I'll take your feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's super inclusive because I am accessible and available, and we don't have a hierarchy here, right? Well, I
Mm-hmm.
see your eyebrow raising and you're
Mm-hmm.
nodding. So what perspectives do you have on that one?
It's so problematic because it's the open door policy. Again, this goes back to intent versus impact that we talk about all the time around. The intentions are coming from a relatively pure place of I want to make myself available to whomever, and at the very same time it's making a statement that doesn't want to acknowledge the power dynamic of having to either physically or virtually or however whatever vehicle it takes to cross over a door frame of power that you don't want to really acknowledge. Like, no, it does take courage for certain people to approach you because you're putting the onus on other people who have less power than you, because remember, they're your direct reports. You're putting the onus on them of opening a door to you when that door could swing both ways. So why don't we hear about, more of the swinging door policy where you can go out of your proverbial and physical office and connect with people, and they can come to you both and
Yeah,
in
yeah.
such a way that acknowledges the power dynamic. And so I really appreciate when people say open door, but yet at the same time, it comes from a stance of ignoring power. And most people that hear that, especially if they've been burned in the past, will be like, yeah, right. Okay. We'll see
Mm-hmm.
based on your
Yeah,
behavior,
right.
whether that's truly an open door policy or if that's just a business gesture.
But even if it is quote unquote truly an open door policy, the reality
Mm-hmm.
remains what you're saying is that that power differential is always there. So some
Always,
people are going to be willing
always.
to walk through the doors and others are not. And if you assume that because these three people, these eight people didn't come and share feedback, that they have no feedback, that's a
Mm-hmm.
mistake, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Oh, yeah,
mistake.
for sure. Well, and when I'm still thinking about physical offices and so forth, I think the person or persons who say open door policy, they also don't even consider the risk that someone is taking by even possibly being seen approaching a physical office to speak to,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Senior Vice President Dr. Lisa Ingerfield and what that looks like, right? Because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
could be
yeah.
oh, well, this person is kissing up to the supervisor,
Mm-hmm.
or this person is always
Right.
the tattletale, or all the different risks that come with even physically approaching an office of someone who claims their door is open, you know as a
Mm-hmm.
gesture. And so given that, I think it's just a dangerous phrase. It's a dangerous exclusive business phrase because it doesn't consider power at all and makes it seem as if
Right.
it's a moot point, and it's certainly applicable.
Okay, so what about meetings, right? In this
Oof.
virtual hybrid world, I've definitely
Yes.
heard some managers say that we've got to have more meetings because we're not in the office. We've got to have more meetings. And those
Mm-hmm.
meetings may or may not have agendas. They may or may not have been called 5 minutes prior to the meeting time, right?
Right,
Um,
right, right.
and so
uh,
I don't agree that hybrid or remote work requires more meetings. I actually find that to be very inefficient and an exclusive practice. But I'm wondering, I want to hear your perspective on this too.
oh gosh, I think sometimes I'm like, okay, does more meetings mean you need to keep your scheduler busy or something? Like, what the hell, man? I mean, it just eh, meetings, in my opinion, are time wasters when they don't have an agenda. They certainly don't have a purpose. And it's not very considerate of the people that have been invited to the meeting, not just in regards to their time and now how it needs to be spread, but also how they appreciate meeting, right? There are some people, for example, that I meet with, they're like, look, 15 minutes and they can conquer the world, right? Other people that I meet with, I know every single time I meet with them, this meeting is going to run over because they are a verbal processor, right? Um, or that person that once again is not considering power, that just, oh, let me just put this meeting on your calendar, Lisa, and I don't care what you had planned, or even if you had a gap on your calendar, who cares? I'm just putting it on your calendar without requesting your time and also without giving you an agenda. What the That is such a, to me, that is a, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that's a power trip. And I've had clients try to do that before to me, saying, oh yeah, I want to meet
Yeah.
with you at this
Yep.
time, didn't ask if I was available, didn't provide an agenda. And when I asked a question back to kind of interrupt the behavior, it was kind of like, oh, interesting. I'd never really thought that someone could not say yes immediately to my meeting, nor have I ever been asked for an agenda in advance.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I remember
Yeah.
years and years and years ago, um, when I was working at a university and I was working with kind of community service learning folks. I was working partnering with the office. I remember one of the employees there said, I do a lot of work with students that if they schedule a meeting with a community partner, that they're on time or they show up for the meeting, they don't cancel it, right? Because their behavior, if they were to cancel, not show up, be late, or some other something, sends the message that the community partner's time is not valuable.
Oh.
And what you just said made me think about that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just dropping a meeting on your calendar, or I'm not writing an agenda, or I want to process through something. So I'm just going to put we're going to have this meeting so that I can,
Yes.
verbally vomit.
Yes.
They're all versions of your time, these other people, is not as important as my time and my needs.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, and to your point too, when I think about your workday, I don't know how long you've been a working adult, but I've been working in some capacity since I was 16 years old. And when I got into a professional office environment, it got even more interesting. Just because I don't have a meeting on that time block, that doesn't mean I'm not occupied. Because
Right?
I
Yes.
had when I was in, which I adore, still speak to my former supervisor to this day, had a wonderful relationship with that supervisor. Most of the requests were not from her, they were from other people. And it was interesting to me how I learned my hard lesson, like maybe the first 3 or 4 months that I was there, where I remember having this stretch of time where for about 2.5 weeks, back to back to back to back to back to back to back meetings. This was pre-COVID, back to back to back to back to back in-person meetings, where there were some days where I literally didn't even walk into my office or turn on my computer because I was in a conference room or I was buzzing around to meetings, and there was no time to actually process and do the work that emerged from the meetings. And then I put a stop to that. Then I started literally like blocking off times in my day that were no meeting days or no meeting half days or whatever it was, because you do need that time. And so I think it's interesting that work or meetings are only translated as work, when non-meeting times is when you also get work done. I don't get it.
Yeah, that's a really, and then thinking about people's working styles, how they process
Absolutely.
information, right? So if I
Mm-hmm.
verbally process versus I auditor auditorily, is that how you'd say that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
or then my nonverbal, other nonverbal ways, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when we've talked about neurodivergence before,
Mm-hmm.
and neurodiversity in the office, and being recognizing that many people think about problems differently and engage
Yes.
with groups or individuals differently, and that
Mm-hmm.
we are all unique in that way, right? And so then I feel like what we're talking about here, particularly all the stuff you've just kind of like mentioned related to meetings, is very quote unquote neurotypical, right? It's
Oh, for
operating on
sure.
this neurotypical spectrum. And then if you have individuals who identify as neurodivergent, and then your whole meeting system,
Mm-hmm.
or okay, we're not going to have a meeting, Shaunna, but I'm going to send you a 3-page email. I'm going to write it all up in an email, and I'm going
Oh,
to
incredible.
like bold, underline, italic, highlight, caps,
Color
lowercase,
code.
right? Yeah, and it's like 19 paragraphs long or something. And then I'm like, you're not able to absorb it, and so then you say something to me. I'm like, didn't you read the email?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
Like
and
it's not inclusive. Yeah.
no, no, it's not. And I'm thinking too, and this is, I'm thinking about neurotypical and neurodivergent. To my knowledge, there were a few meetings that I had that, to my knowledge, there was no one else in the room that was neurodivergent that I was aware of. I may be wrong on that. I'm making a little bit of an assumption here. But even in that case, for the neurotypical people, they also did not have time to process what was given to them, because the dreaded meetings that I will never forget were the ones that were on Friday afternoons that were called at 3:30, because that was the only time that worked for faculty after a week's worth of teaching. And we'd come into this meeting at 3:30, and it would be, it's like a library. You could hear a pin drop because people had their heads down reading the documents that they didn't have time to read before the meeting, which also was not conducive for processing. So it doesn't benefit anybody. And so, I keep thinking to myself, how do we make the work life more difficult for, especially for neurodivergent folks, but for a lot of people, because we put this power dynamic into play where we're either going to manage people's time for them or manage people's information for them in ways that only certain people have power over it. And these are
Yeah.
traditional approaches. I mean, Lisa, that's why that whole quote that I saw on Instagram that said, "Stop calling meetings so you can simply organize your own thoughts with witnesses." That just cracks me up when I read it, because on one hand, I do know as a facilitator that there are some meetings that you really do need to ideate. The purpose of the meeting is to ideate, but say that rather than
Right.
every
Be clear.
meeting.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than every meeting being one person of power's ideation meeting and everybody else is held hostage as a witness to watch it until everyone's released to the next meeting.
Right. Right. Yeah.
That approach is really warped.
All right. Well, that was good. I felt like I worked through some of my exclusive business practices problems there with you. I knew you'd have thoughts. I knew you would have thoughts.
Well, I'm sure there's other ones that I haven't thought about yet in regards to exclusive business practices. We might need to start a list based on what we have here, but just things to think about in workplaces that say they want to be inclusive, but they're still holding some traditional approaches
Yeah.
that they
Yeah.
just haven't thought through. But let's get into phase 3. And I don't know if this phase should just be Shaunna's soapbox, Shaunna's pet peeve, Shaunna's whatever. But one of the phrases that I wish we could just completely obliterate in the English language is now common sense. That's my new phrase, Lisa. That's my new phrase that I am going to work my best to never use, especially when it comes to a DEI approach to work
Okay.
or anything.
Okay.
So I was in a training a few weeks ago, and it was very clear that folks in the room were in disagreement in regards to what was appropriate behavior, inclusive behavior. I'm not going to get into the details of the behavior itself because that's not necessary. But the person that you could see was getting flustered with the conversation, the person's neck and face was red as a beet. Like they were, clearly trying to hold on to their professional composure, but clearly worked up biologically. Okay. And finally just became exasperated and said, well, it's just common sense, right? And if I wanted to be the asshole in the moment, Lisa, I was facilitating, but if I wanted to be the asshole in the moment, my brain immediately, whenever I hear common sense, turns to, or kind of reframes like we talked about last week, it turns to whose common sense? Whose sense are we talking about that we are generalizing to other people for which it may not be common, right? So
Yep. Yep.
when you think about that common sense piece, I'm like, well, what are we talking about? Because your common sense may not be mine and mine may not be yours. And so, of course, Lisa, look, I am not a linguist or any of that, but it just took me on one of my midnight rabbit trails of what did the original word mean. What I do know is some of it came from Aristotle, some of it came from Thomas More, but from what I understand, the term common sense has often been used in American politics, coming from Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, obviously, from 1776. And that was going back to, spurring the American Revolution. And it's encouraging colonists to break away from Britain and King George III, all of that. And as I'm reading the definition of it, it's more so speaking towards human senses, the five senses that we hold, and how does that help us to understand the world, right? So whether it's my sight, whether it's hearing, whatever, touch, taste, those all pulled together to help me understand the world. That's the original definition. The way in which we use it now is this shortened, evolved definition of the way I know things should be the way that everyone else understands things. And that does not hold true. And I have found it to completely crumble in DEI spaces and places, because what I thought was okay is not okay. Or something we've talked about, Lisa, on this podcast in regards to workplaces. One quick example, the definition of how can we say, if you have a dress code at your workplace, how Shaunna defines business professional may be completely different from Lisa's definition of business professional. That's just one of many I could give you, but my common sense of professional may not be Lisa's definition of professional. And so common sense then proves not to be common because we're landing in different places. So why do we use it? I don't get it.
Yeah. That's such a good, it's a little bit of an aha moment, because I was thinking about like geography, nationality. Well, I guess nationality is geography, but geography internal to the United States, then nationality, thinking globally, then gender, probably race, all these other identities and experiences that would create a set of norms that might be considered common sense within your community, but you just kind of extrapolate it out and believe it's common sense to everyone. So I'm actually thinking about, in politics, we hear a lot about common sense gun legislation, right? And I align with quote unquote common sense gun legislation, right? Some of the kind of items that are listed under that. But if you believe, again, this kind of goes back to phase one, but if you believe very strongly in the right to bear arms and the Second Amendment, and you believe that that means that you should be able to have a gun anytime you want it, you know, whatever, right? Then common sense gun legislation that regulates or limits that right as you see it is not common sense to you, right? It's like ludicrous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So that was just, when you were talking, that kind of struck me, because we are making an assumption that certain policy solutions are common sense. And at what point does it become common sense? So let's say, like, in a group of 100 people, 75 people agree with A and 25 agree with B. Does A become the common sense because the majority of people believe it? Or is it just, should the better phrase be a majority of people believe this?
Yeah, that's where I land with it, is that a majority of people believe this, but a majority could be 51-49%, right? So it's still substantial disagreement with a stance, right? And so, that's why I'm like, we got to be very careful with, first of all, just the phrasing of common sense, but the assumption of common sense, because I think that sets up unrealistic expectations. Why don't you know this, Lisa? Because this should be common sense. Why don't you feel this way, Shaunna? Because this should be common sense. And I'm like, no, not based on their perspective. So when you're bringing up the whole common sense gun law, so forth, as I've shared many times on this podcast before, I'm from Southern Virginia. Hunting is a big deal. Having hunting rifles and other forms of firearms in the home, in your car, wherever, is completely normal and would not necessarily take me, as someone originally from Southern Virginia, off guard. Whereas if anyone else in the country from other places that don't have hunters and a large population of that would be like, okay, this is not my norm. This makes me uncomfortable. I'm not used to having a firearm in every corner of every room of every house. It's just not what is common for them.
Yeah.
And so with that, it's like, how does that then, let's circle back, Lisa, how does this then feed into the unconscious biases that we carry into every stance? Right. Like I could carry in my unconscious bias and say, well, I don't know why Lisa's making a big deal about that rifle that's sitting in the corner of my house when she comes visit. Well, maybe she wasn't raised that way. Maybe she's never lived in an environment where that was common. So of course she would feel uncomfortable with. fill in the blank. And so, I just think we need to be very careful because it sets up unrealistic expectations for folks that we don't
Mm-hmm.
have as many similarities as we thought we had. And it kind of reminds me, Lisa,
Yeah.
of when you and I are looking at data on a project, like we are careful not to generalize things that should not be generalizable. And we do it every day when we say things are common sense.
Yeah, that's a great point too, right? Like, in the kind of statistics world or research world, yes, there's a
Mm.
very precise parameters around that generalizability. But when we say something is common sense, that's also another little ding for me. So around, yeah, gosh, we do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do it. I'm guilty. I do it all the
yeah, I
time.
mean, I say it. Like, I mean, we used to joke that my dad had no common sense because he couldn't use a can opener.
Oh, goodness.
And so now I'm thinking, I mean, that's still funny, right? But I still,
Uh-huh.
but
Uh-huh.
like, if you grew up in an environment where can openers were not a thing, I mean,
Exactly.
that isn't true for my dad, but
Right, right, right,
yeah,
right. Yeah.
then yeah, that wouldn't be common for you, right? Like, because it's not something that you've ever used before.
Well, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, it reminds me of that little video that I've watched 1,000 times that just tickles me so on Instagram, where the little girl is at her grandmother's house, and her grandmother still has one of those rotary phones where you gotta, do it around like this to get all the numbers. And so the grandmother tells the granddaughter, why don't you use the rotary phone? I'll show you how to do it and dial your mother's phone number. And she does this, and her mother's iPhone rings. And the little girl's like, oh my God, it's magic, right? The common sense would have been, baby, you should have known how to use a rotary phone. No, because that's not common to her
Right.
generation. Like, think
Right.
about how many times a young person picks up a phone and FaceTimes a person and does everything but actually calls a person on a phone, because that's not common to their generation, right? So,
Yeah.
just so many things that, I mean, it's just so many things that are not common, that we place responsibility on people to know that there's a very slim chance that they would ever know.
And then we also ascribe intelligence to folks if they're not doing the thing that we think is common sense,
There
right?
you
Because
go.
I'm
Yes.
also thinking your generation piece is also making me think about these little montages on social media related to young people telling the time on a
Yes.
analog clock, right? On a
Yes.
non-digital clock, and they're not able to do it. And I don't know how much of that is just for the camera or how much of that is actually true. But if you've never read a clock that has hands and minutes and stuff, right? You've only ever looked at digital where it's numbers,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're like, oh my gosh, how stupid can you be? Me. I made comment. I'm thinking in my head, oh my God, that's absolutely outrageous. How is that even possible? How could you not read a clock? Right. So yeah, slap on my wrist there because,
No, it's
yeah.
happened. I mean, so let me give you an exact example of this happening. When I was still working at Maryland, I had a student that was brilliant, an astrophysics major. I can't even pronounce astrophysics major, but also played on an athletic team, right? And of course, you're told what time to be at the bus if you have an away game, and you better not be a second late, or else you're just not going to play in the game, right? And so one of his coaches told him, make sure that you're at the bus at quarter after whatever the hour was, right? Again, if you're not an analog person and you've never been an analog person, in fact, lots of public schools have actually omitted analog time in the curriculum because they just literally don't have time to teach it. So the student shows up at 25 after the hour instead of 15 after the hour, because 25 is a quarter of a dollar, a quarter of 100.
Yes.
And so it made
Yes.
complete sense to him. And his coaches were looking at him like, you're an idiot because you don't know what time it is. When I'm thinking to myself, that baby went to a public school,
Mm-hmm.
apparently never had the opportunity to run into analog clocks regularly. So how would he know? Like,
Yeah,
I'm
that is,
always asking the
yeah.
question, how would
Yeah.
someone know this? Has their life led them past the knowledge of this? And if it hasn't, then why are
Yeah.
we upset or ascribing intelligence?
That's a perfect example, right? And so it also goes back to phase one, where you understand the logic of why this person was like, oh, 25 after, it's a quarter. And that's what,
Mm-hmm.
like the logic of that makes sense once you understand it. And I don't think
Mm-hmm.
we do that enough, thinking about going back to phase one again, which I know this wasn't intended to connect, but it really does actually connect pretty well.
Oh, see, ever so often we get on the right path, y'all, and we don't even realize we get on the right path.
Right,
But
right.
but I do think there's, similar to what we were saying about, the DNC, watching the DNC, watching the RNC. Can we at least follow the logic?
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah,
if we can't, that's another issue. But can
yeah,
we at least follow the logic? So, I understand now why certain people know things and certain people don't know things based on their lived experience. How
yeah,
would you know this and why would you know this?
exactly.
You know, so,
All
oh,
right. All
look,
right. That was some good stuff. I had some aha moments during this conversation. I love it when that happens. I am a
oh,
better person for this conversation. So
oh,
yay.
look, you and me both, because let me tell you, this made me reflect on a number of different topics that I hadn't taken the time. I had a question mark in my brain. And I think I want to flesh out some more around all three of these phases, of course. But all right, Lisa, let me tell the folks where they can
Mm-hmm.
find us. Certainly, you can find us here on YouTube, also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Instagram at Unfazed Pod, LinkedIn as well on Unfazed Pod, and info at unfazedpodcast.com is a great email to use to get in touch with us. And if you forget all of that, go to unfazedpodcast.com, where you can access all of the new and the old shows. Lisa, I cannot believe this is what, episode 157? Goodness.
Ooh, yeah. I think
Ooh, we're
so. We're
getting
getting
up
close
there.
to 160. Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting up there. So please, y'all, if you like this week's episode, please like, subscribe, leave a review, share this with your friends. I've heard people even use some of our podcast phases as staff meeting sparks of discussion. So please think about using that and sharing it with others in this phase of your life. So until next week.
All right. See you soon, all.